Hello to our community group leaders and our community group members. This is the Teaching Series Extra for Sunday, April 15th, 2018, and we are in the second week of our new teaching series on 1 Peter called Stranger Days. So the idea of this teaching series kind of began to formulate in my mind a few months ago. On Netflix, my family was watching Stranger Things, and if you're not familiar with that, I'll just give you a brief rundown that there's a real world in the 1980s where a group of kids live, but there's also an upside-down world, a world that looks similar to our world, but it's hostile, it's dark, and it's scary. And so one of the kids in this series gets stuck in the upside down. And I started thinking that there's so much about our world that just seems upside down, that there's so much about our world that is opposite of what we think it should be, that's hostile, that's even dark. And so how do we as followers of Jesus, until we get to our true home of heaven, how do we live in this upside down world? How do we live during these stranger days? Well, 1 Peter deals directly with issues that early Christians face and living in their culture and that we still face today. So as we go into the second week of this teaching series, we are going to deal very directly with suffering and with joy. These are two things. One we hope to avoid in life, the other we hope to experience. How do suffering and joy interact? What do they mean? And here's the challenging statement that I'm going to give, that suffering is not an obstacle to joy. Suffering is actually an opportunity for joy. And on the surface you may dismiss that, but we'll talk through the scripture in 1 Peter 1, 6 through 12 about that suffering is not an obstacle to joy, it's an opportunity for joy. And so how do our sufferings, how do they result in some good? How can God use our sufferings? So I'm going to give you this illustration. I probably will cut this from the main body of the message, but if I were leading a community group, this is a story, this is an illustration that I would use. Bob Schieffer a few years ago was hosting Face the Nation, and they had T.D. Jakes on. They were interviewing him in a format where there was a live audience. And at the end, one of the audience participants said, "Hey, you're a preacher. Why don't you preach us a sermon?" And I'm just going to read this little excerpt from a book called Leadership Pain. T.D. Jakes gave a simple sermon that day. He said, "When you're born, you're like a key with no cuts in it." Just think of your house key. You were like a key with no cuts in it. As you go through life, each wound, failure, hurt, cuts into that strip of metal. And one day, there is a clear click. Your pain has formed the key that slips into the lock that opens your future. And that's something good to know, that as we go through life, the suffering that we experience is not haphazard. God is using that suffering. He'll use it in some way to craft our character that will be the key to unlock our future, and it probably will be in the service of others, that we can use our suffering in the service of others. So sit with that, wrestle with this a bit as you listen to 1 Peter 1, that suffering is not an obstacle to joy. It's actually an opportunity for joy. And let's see how God will use your sufferings to create joy in your life. May the Lord bless you. As always, I'm proud to serve alongside you. Take care.